Hello YouTube. Bane666 here. Welcome to Propaganda of Toxic Feminism, the series in which I expose and debunk falsehoods, misconceptions, and outright lies spread about the men's rights movement. So let's get stuck into it. Okay guys, this first one is likely to make you angry, so you might want to put down any items in your hands before we get stuck into it. Trust me, it's that bad. I'm actually going to break it up into two parts, and this first part is almost entirely ad hominem attacks and shaming language. And really is a testament to the type of scum we are dealing with, and you shouldn't doubt for a second that this guy is scum. In the second part, we will see he presents some evidence, if you want to call it that, before going back to ad homs and shaming language. But first, we have to dig our way through this steaming pile of bullshit. So best grab your shovel and put on your full body protection suit, if you are coming along on this ride. The article, if we can even call it that, appears on a webpage called bodyforwife.com and is written by James Fell, who has written for Time magazine, where of course he pulled the Elliot Rodger fallacy. So this guy isn't just some blogger with a couple of hundred followers, he can be considered mainstream. The article is called "Let's Call Men's Rights Activists by Their True Names." And then there is a picture of a crying baby. But it gets worse. A half-century or so ago those in possession of a Y chromosome had it good, the white ones, at least. Yes, because World War I and II were just one big long party. Next. Back in the good old days, it was legal for a man to rape his wife. But then the feminist bitches took over, and starting in the 1970s they began taking away a husband's rights, and by 1993 spousal rape was illegal in every state. 22 long years since freedom died. Okay, so I'm only at the second paragraph, and already I'm fighting the urge to call him a cunt. I know some people don't like me using that word, but let's be realistic here, sometimes there just isn't a better word to describe someone like this. I mean, look at that last line. 22 long years since freedom died. What a cunt. What an absolute scumbag. And possibly someone who should be watched closely, if he thinks raping your wife is something men do for fun. But let's look at his link. It's actually one of the few links in the article that isn't to a "We Hunted the Man Boobs" article. It takes us to RAIN, the Rape, Abuse and Incest National Network. The link states, "Marital rape is a serious form of violence that can have life-shattering effects for its victims. While marital rape has been illegal in every state in the District of Columbia since 1993, it is infrequently prosecuted." What is marital rape? Marital rape occurs when your spouse forces you to take part in certain sex acts without your consent. It is a form of intimate partner violence, that is, an abuse of power by which one spouse attempts to establish dominance and control over the other. Research shows that it can be equally, if not more, emotionally and physically traumatizing than rape by a stranger. Okay, so far so good. I agree so far, rape is bad in any situation. But I can imagine it could be worse, if it's within what's meant to be the safe space of a marriage. And so far the language used is gender neutral. For example, it says, an abuse of power by which one spouse attempts to establish dominance and control over the other. Notice it doesn't say husband over wife. But if we continue reading. While every state has its own laws on the subject, broadly defined, marital rape includes any unwanted intercourse or penetration, vaginal, anal, or oral, obtained by force, threat of force, or when the wife is unable to consent. Oh, that's disappointing. It seems that according to this, husbands being forced or coerced into unwanted sex acts by their wives isn't considered rape. Remember the first line of this section read, marital rape occurs when your spouse forces you to take part in certain sex acts without your consent. It seems the term, certain sex acts, limits the definition of rape to something men do to women. So although I would agree, that on the surface, it does seem terrible that legally a husband could force, pressure, or coerce his wife into sex without legal consequence, right up until 1993, but this doesn't take into consideration that it is still legal for a wife to force, pressure, or coerce her husband into sex without legal consequence today. But as James Fell is an apostle of the brand of feminism, that only sees the bad in masculinity, and only the good in femininity, I'm sure it would never cross his mind that a woman could pressure a man into unwanted sex. After all, men only think with their dicks, right, James? Next. Things just keep going downhill for us poor men. Women can control their reproductive organs now and even get credit cards without a husband's co-signature. And since some of them can make enough money to be able to afford to leave their husbands, they leave their husbands. And I don't have any problem with any of this. I believe in women's reproductive rights, I just also believe in male reproductive rights, something James seems unfamiliar with. I have no problem with women earning equal money for equal work, or having their own credit cards, with their own responsibility for that card. After all, why would I want to be financially responsible for another human being? Which brings us to divorce. Once again, I have no problem with women divorcing their husbands if they wish. I do however have issues with the divorce courts, and the unfair treatment received by many men. Which is one of the reasons why I will never get married. So I have no desire to return to the world that James Fell describes, nor do I know of any MRAs who wish to return to that world. Personally, I think it's restrictive and burdensome for men. Why should I spend my life slaving away to provide for another? Next. Can't fuck her whenever I want. Can't keep her in financial bondage. Can't make her keep popping out babies. Can't make her stay. Look what they've done to us. #man tears. See, I told you he's a cunt. He is actually suggesting that the purpose of the men's rights movement is to keep women as sex slaves. Wow. Amazing. So wanting to ban male genital mutilation is about keeping women as sex slaves? And fathers wanting access to their children is really about keeping women in financial bondage? And wanting to fix the problems of male homelessness and male suicide is really about keeping women barefoot and pregnant? Wow. Just fucking amazing. Now, some of you might have noticed something with the sentences I just spoke. It's a very important something, so I'm going to point it out in case you missed it. Every men's rights issue I just mentioned has to do with men. But everything that James mentioned has to do with women. Which one actually sounds like something that a group calling themselves men's rights activists would say? It seems that James is incapable of actually acknowledging men's rights issues, and has to instead project imaginary female issues onto us. Thus not only derailing the conversation, but demonizing us at the same time. Scum. Next. Back in the real world, 2 years ago Steph Guthrie wrote an insightful blog where she examined that what men's rights activists really want is not equality, but preservation of male power and privilege. And so, she coined the term male power advocates, because that's what they are. Except it only tells part of the story. I'm going to save Steph Guthrie's article for another episode, I think it needs its own space, so for now, next. Yes, MRAs really do advocate for returning their lost privileges. Like I wrote in my piece for Time magazine last year exposing MRAs, imagine a kid who got a cone with 3 scoops of ice cream in it. Good flavors, too. Like peanut butter chocolate, plus a scoop of cookie dough. In a waffle cone. And then this child whines about the lack of chocolate sprinkles on top. Unfortunately for James, his poorly constructed metaphor does not constitute actual evidence. It assumes that all men are privileged, and that all women are not. When in reality his poorly constructed metaphor more accurately represents modern-day feminism. After all, didn't Jessica Valenti write an article claiming that women deserve to be paid more money for less work? Sounds exactly like a child whining about not getting sprinkles on top to me. Or what about women getting lesser sentences for the same crimes, yet feminists are still pushing to close down women's prisons? Next. But what is missing is that the chocolate sprinkles won't make them happy. Even if we to return to the fabulous 50s, where male power was far more pronounced than it is now, and yes, it's still very pronounced, the type of guys who make up MRA wouldn't be happy. Wow. Just fucking amazing. This guy is absolutely delusional. And you'll notice he doesn't supply any links. No links to MRAs saying they want to return to the 50s in articles. No links to MRAs saying they want to return to the 50s in videos. Not even a link to a biased and dishonest man boobs hit piece. Nothing. Because James has just made this shit up. He's decided what we are like, and what we want, instead of investigating and finding out who we are and what we want. This is nothing but a projection of a colossal testosterone boogeyman. Next. That's because they're losers. Whiny. Fucking losers. These days, MRA take to the internet in a circle jerk of bitching and moaning about how life isn't fair. In the old days, they lined up at the bar in a circle jerk of bitching and moaning about how life isn't fair. The only good thing about the good old days is that only the poor bartender had to listen to their bullshit. Funny he's not concerned about feminists on the internet bitching and moaning about how life isn't fair. Next. See, even before feminism there was winners and losers. Back then there were people who were angry, unfriendly, stupid, unwashed, greasy, sleazy, socially inept, assholish, ineffectual, unemployable, unpromotable. Wow. James, intellectual giant that he is, really knows how to make a rock-solid argument. I mean, his lack of evidence, and constant use of ad homs, must really make his feminist readers proud. Next. They sat around the bar and blamed their boss, the government, the blacks, the Jews, the Italians, the Irish, the Hispanics, bad luck and God for their woes. I'm sure there was also plenty of hate spewed towards women for such men's inability to get laid. And then feminists came along and blamed everything on men. Next. Let's boil some of this down to one parameter for a moment, 6. Wow. So fighting for male issues is really only about getting laid? Wow. Because nothing turns a woman on like bringing up male genital mutilation, or the male homeless problem. Most women just slide right off their seats when you start talking about male issues. Right? Actually, I think most of us know the exact opposite is true. If our main goal was getting laid, pandering to women, and throwing our fellow man under the bus, like James is doing here, is a much better strategy. Unfortunate, but true. Next. I like getting laid. It's fun. Back when I couldn't get laid, I wondered what I needed to do to get laid. Now James is starting to sound like a pickup artist. Next. And so, I worked on me. I worked on my education, my personality, my skill set, my career and my body. And guess what happened? 6. And love and marriage and family and success and all that awesome stuff. And MRA is a loser who doesn't look inward on how to improve, but looks outward on whom to blame for sucking, because self-improvement is hard. Also, not having women praise their genitalia the way it happens in porn makes them angry. So I wonder if James would say the same thing to the fat acceptance crowd. You know, the type who complain about not being accepted, or getting male attention because of their weight. Using James' logic, shouldn't they be looking inward, and not blaming the outside world? Shouldn't they be working on themselves, so others are more likely to accept them? Because that's what James is suggesting to us. And that last line. Also, not having women praise their genitalia the way it happens in porn makes them angry. Wow, it's almost like he's a really bad po. Unfortunately though, he's the real deal. As I pointed out earlier, this jerk has written for Time magazine. Unbelievable. Next. Of course, they'll just say I haven't had my red pill moment yet, and that by trying to better myself I'm playing to the female-dominated matrix and all I can think of is how to please women because I like to use my penis for stuff other than urination. Hey, my website and social media are all called Body for Wife, so it's pretty obvious what my motivations are. It has nothing to do with an old inside joke with friends from when the book Body for Life was popular. Okay, so in the past, I've been critical of both sides for using sex-shaming language. You know the type of thing, you're only an MRA because you cannot get laid, or you're only a male feminist because you want to get laid. That type of bullshit. It really is a weak argument to make. And I urge everyone, on both sides, to do better, and discuss real issues. But having said that, after reading James Fell's article so far, I have to say, based on his own words, in his case it may actually be a legitimate argument. He seems obsessed with labeling us all as sexual deviants wanting to use and possess women as sex objects. This line of argument is nothing new by our opposition. It demonizes us by associating us with feminist negative stereotypes about masculinity and male sexuality. And I would normally think that that's all James is doing, albeit even more over the top than normal. But the fact that he also talks about himself getting laid, makes me think that maybe it's not so much an attempt to demonize us, as it is James projecting his own twisted desires. I have to ask the question, could James deep down, actually be a pickup artist, who has been trained to think he is a feminist? Does he accuse us of wanting to go back to the 50s with obedient wives as sex slaves, because deep down, that's what he really wants? Of course, this is all speculation on my part. But considering his irrational anger towards us, based on irrational beliefs we actually don't hold, and the fact that he presents no evidence to support these claims, makes me ask the question, how much of this is projection? Is James Fell one of the few good men? Or just one of the few bad ones, in disguise? Next.
On to the topic of two subjects that I am somewhat heavily involved with, and the other one heavily involved with. That is feminism and pro-choice.
This pale befanged creature of the night is Gothmoth. And as she just stated, her video is about feminism and pro-choice. I'm only going to be going through the part of the video concerning feminism and men's rights, so if you wish to see her views on pro-choice, you'll find the link below, as always. But before going back to her video, we really need to take a look at the description. It reads: Feminism section. What is feminism? The fight, want for equality between genders, sexes, races, sexualities, cultures, etc. What isn't feminism? The want for female superiority, swerf, turf. Is feminism needed? Yes, so long as there is inequality, especially between genders, sexes, feminism will be needed. Why are you a feminist? Because I want equality. Why isn't humanist, equalist, MRA for actual equality? Because they automatically place men above women and often ignore problems such as male rape, the pink tax and unequal pay. Females face more inequality and thus the movement for equality must focus on them more. Oh, so humanist, equalists, and MRAs place men above women? Really? I didn't know that. And if you are unfamiliar with the so-called pink tax, it's the fact that some products targeted at females cost more than those targeted at males. This of course is because the products are different. And if you disagree, then just buy the products targeted at men. She goes on to say, I want equality. Does that make me a feminist? If you do want actual equality, then yes, it damn well does. Can I be a feminist and pro-fetus? No, abortion is a human right and pro-fetus actively supports inequality, the removal of the rights of all people capable of becoming pregnant. If you're pro-fetus, you don't want equality. Does feminism only help women and other oppressed, discriminated groups? No, feminism helps everyone, as everyone is somehow negatively affected by inequality, the patriarchy. On with the video.
Now, basically, feminism is the basic belief that the genders, all genders, should be seen as equal.
Unless you are a straight male. Next.
That is the very, very basic of it. Is that entirely sum up and completely what it is? Of course not. It's pretty much impossible to do that to such a large movement that's been going on for so long. Now, of course, there are different waves with it, and some ways people are like, yay! And then other ways people are like, what the fuck's wrong with this? Now, the wave that people have been doing the what the fuck is wrong with this wave is the third wave feminism. which is the wave that's currently going on right now, if I am correct. Now, I don't really identify with any specific wave. I just generally want genders to be deemed equal, racism to go away, which it honestly never will, but hey, we can try, and for things like sexism to go bye-bye. No more hitting on people because of their gender or...
Unless you are a straight male. Next.
Sexuality, or any of that crap. So I want things like complete and true equal play, no more, oh, that's a guy's job, or that's a girl's job.
So we need to force more women into becoming garbage collectors, and take away their free will in the name of equality. Okay, got it. Next.
No more of only certain genders can wear certain colors, and then there was that whole, like, pink is not manly, and then everyone started freaking out and go, pink is manly!
Need I point out that in her own description, she refers to the pink tax. This is referring to a supposed tax on females. So by calling it the pink tax, aren't feminists just supporting gender norms? Why feminists, why? Why are you supporting the patriarchy when you should be smashing it? Next.
So, stuff like that. So.
Oh, you mean the really important stuff. Because a boy wearing pink is a much more important issue than, say, I don't know, maybe something like the human right to genital integrity. Next.
And I have had arguments on here about feminism a few times.
And I get the feeling you are about to have a few more. Next.
For anyone who goes through everything that I comment on, which would be kind of hard because I comment a lot, you would probably eventually notice that there's some sort of feminist comment going on somewhere somehow. Now, what feminism is not is man-hating.
Patriarchy theory is in every way man-hating. It only acknowledges the negatives of males and masculinity, and only the positives of femininity. It reduces males to the perpetrator class, and females to the victim class. Even when the female is the violent aggressor, and the male is her victim, the feminist ideology of patriarchy theory will still class the female as the victim of some male somewhere, and thus devoid of responsibility for her actions, while simultaneously dismissing the abuse suffered by the male victim, because he probably deserved it, or some such bullshit. Next.
It is not man-hating, and it is not the want for female superiority. It's actually the opposite. If you want female superiority, you are not a feminist. A feminist wants equality. It does not want either group to be superior. At all. It doesn't want any sexuality to be superior, or any race, or any of that shit. Like, complete equality.
Unless you are a straight male. Next.
And this is where the whole equalitist or humanist thing comes in. That is not a group that wants equality. That is a group that wants things to stay generally the same as they are.
I don't think she knows what the word equality means. Next.
Which is, in short, they kind of want male superiority. And then now you've got the menist thing going on, which basically just wants male superiority.
When someone refers to the meninist thing as an actual movement, and not as a satire that it is, I honestly don't know if I should laugh, or just feel despair. And the really sad fact is, these individuals are always so confident that they are 100% correct, with no possibility they might be wrong. And of course, anyone who disagrees is just ignorant. Yet they are so ignorant as to not know that meninism isn't a serious movement. I guess this is what happens when entitled children use Tumblr as their news source. But more on that later. Next.
All that is just male superiority, and people going, I got friend zoned! Yeah! And getting pissed off because the girl didn't want to go out with them. And whatnot. Now, feminism, whilst I am involved with it, I'm not super heavily involved with it. Not enough so to, like, run a feminist blog or something like that. I'm not even close to that involved in it. But I am involved in it, and I do support it, definitely. Just not super heavily.
So, Zorro Baggins left a long comment listing many issues facing men, and Gothmoth replied with, "Go look on Tumblr or anywhere in actual feminism. Feminists deal with all those things, though feminists tend to be more concerned with the almost guarantee of a woman being sexually harassed or raped in the military, or that half of bisexual people have been victims of rape, etc. Oh, Tumblr is where the real feminism is." Somehow I don't think that really helps Gothmoth's case for feminism being about equality. And half of bisexual people have been victims of rape? Really? I can honestly say I've never heard that one before. But I also left her a comment. I said, "What's your opinion on the gender sentencing gap?" To which she replied, "I think it sucks, and P.S. women get twice as long jail sentences than men for self-defense manslaughter due to domestic abuse." Really? I came across this claim over a year ago, and pulled it apart then. But I was wondering where she got this information from. So I asked for a citation. And I was told to go do my own research. I repeated my request, and of course, was never given a source. So I have no idea where she got her information from, but I have come across the claim before. Last year I did a video, link below, on a post I found on Facebook, on a page called, Unpacking the F-Word. I've also seen this claim on Tumblr, sometimes in a cut-down version. It reads, "The average prison sentence for men who kill their intimate partners is 2 to 6 years. Women who kill their partners are sentenced, on average, to 15 to 17 years. A pair of Maryland cases vividly illustrates this inequality in sentencing. In one case, a judge in Baltimore County, Maryland sentenced Kenneth Peacock to 18 months for killing his unfaithful wife. The very next day, another judge in the same county sentenced Patricia Ann Hawkins to 3 years in prison for killing her abusive husband. Significantly, the prosecutor in the Peacock case requested a sentence twice as long as the one imposed, while the prosecutor in the Hawkins case requested 1/3 of the sentence imposed. As many as 90% of the women in prison today, 2008, for killing men had been battered by those men. As I have covered this in more detail in a past video, I'll only go over these claims briefly here. Let's start with the claims about Kenneth Peacock and Patricia Ann Hawkins. The reason for the different sentence length has nothing to do with gender, but with the circumstances of each case. Kenneth Peacock was a long-distance trucker, who came home unexpectedly to find his wife in bed with another man. After hours of drinking and arguing, he shot her. He pleaded guilty to manslaughter. And for the record, I think he should have received a much harsher sentence. Patricia Ann Hawkins, on the other hand, waited until her allegedly abusive husband was asleep, and then poured lighter fluid on him, and set him on fire. I also think she should have received a much harsher sentence. What Patricia Ann Hawkins did was premeditated, it was planned and not spur of the moment, which is why I suspect she got a longer sentence. Not to mention the severity of her actions. Burning to death is a much worse way to go than being shot by a shotgun. Not that I'm condoning either action. Like I said, I would have given them both harsher sentences. Another factor could be that she was unlucky with the judge she got. It's possible her judge has a history of handing out harsher sentences. And it should also be mentioned that these are only 2 examples, from one county, that happened in the early 90s. The quote from the bottom, "As many as 90% of the women in prison today, 2008, for killing men had been battered by those men," is also from the 90s, despite the fact that it clearly has 2008 in brackets. Can be traced back to a Boston Globe article from 1992, called, "Women Far Less Likely to Kill Than Men." No one sure why. When I did my original video on this over a year ago, this article was stuck behind the paywall, but many of you found copies and sent them to me, so a special thanks to everyone who helped out with that. It's been on my list of articles to pull apart for a while, and I will get around to going through the entire article in detail one day, but for now, let's have a quick look. Link below if you wish to read the entire thing. The article states, "As many as 90% of the women in jail today for murdering men had been battered by those men. A much smaller number, about 3 in 100,000, kill their children as a result of a postpartum psychosis that has gone untreated." So this is the origin of the 90% figure often quoted by the Michigan Women Justice and Clemency Project, and even now, but the Boston Globe author, Allison Bass, doesn't tell us where she got it from. Is it from statistics? Or a feminist ideologue? Who knows? So let's have a look at a few more quotes from this article before moving on to look at actual statistics from that time period. In detailed research, Lewis has found that men who have been horribly abused as children and suffered from a constellation of psychiatric and neurological disorders are much more likely than others to become extremely violent. But as Lewis notes, it takes the Y chromosome, that is maleness, to complete the picture. I think it would be interesting to see if there is a pattern of which parent, or if both parents, were responsible for the abuse of these men. Are men who are abused by their mothers more likely to grow up to be wife-beaters, or are they more likely if abused by fathers, or by both parents, or is there no difference, and the only common factor is abuse? Of course, it would also be interesting to look at the background of abuse of women, to see if there are any patterns in childhood abuse. Lewis and others believe male hormones such as testosterone and androgen play a key role in making men much more aggressive than women. But merely having a high level of testosterone does not make someone violent. Many men with high levels are simply more competitive. They channel their hormonal drives into constructive pursuits. Okay, so there are a couple of ways to look at this. If we accept that testosterone makes men more competitive, and more likely to take chances, as I've heard others state, then it would not only account for some men being more likely to use violence, but would also account for those men who are more likely to reach the top and become CEOs or whatever. This option can be summed up by the Camille Paglia quote, "There is no female Mozart because there is no female Jack the Ripper." Although I do think testosterone probably does play a factor in males' ability to take risks and be competitive, I also think Paglia's quote is a vast oversimplification. Of course, the other option often put forward by feminists is that males and females are born exactly the same, and are conditioned to be different by society. The article continues. It seems equally clear that culture plays a role. Men are brought up to fight and to defend themselves, and they are reinforced for engaging in those behaviors, says Robert Brentke, a forensic psychologist at New England Forensic Associates in Arlington and an authority on sexual violence. When they are challenged by a bully at school, their fathers will teach them how to fight with their fists. But how many times do parents teach girls to defend themselves? I find this an interesting quote for a number of reasons. Firstly, it probably is true that males are more likely to be taught to defend themselves, against other males, with the use of violence. But they are also more likely to be taught to defend females with the use of violence, thus reducing the need for females to use violence. The other interesting thing is that female violence has steadily been increasing over the last 30 years across the Western world. Next, girls are taught to nurture and care for others. Some psychologists believe females may be biochemically wired to be more giving and nurturing. For whatever reason, women respond to conflict in ways very differently than men do. So I guess the big question is, why are there so many more men in prison than women? Is it society's fault? Are men taught to be more aggressive? Could it be that, as stated before, most violent men grow up as victims of abuse? And if so, could it be society's dismissal of such abuse, because they are male, that causes or contributes to their violent tendencies? We all know the shaming tactics that are used when men try to talk about their issues. We are told women, universally, have it worse, regardless of individual circumstances. And let's not forget people like James Fell, who likes to refer to other men as crying whiny fucking losers, when they try to talk about the issues that affect them and other men. Or alternatively, is it nature's fault? Does testosterone just make men more aggressive and competitive? If men throughout history have been expected to be providers and protectors, then wouldn't this make sense? Wouldn't it also explain why more men occupy the top positions of power, as opposed to discrimination against women? Or is there yet a third possibility as to why more males are in prison than females? To answer this last question, I'm going to turn to a post I found on Permutation of Ninjas. It's rather long, but worth going through. Having said that though, it's called On Why Most Convicts Are Men, and it probably has nothing to do with men committing more crime. One interesting facet of the debate regarding men's rights is incarceration rates. In the US, 93% of people behind bars are men, with only 7% being women. This could, of course, be seen as an example of the violent and base tendencies of men, but a more enlightened person would probably take the position that our society conditions men into a role which by nature is more likely to encourage violent or criminal behavior. On one side men are socialized towards aggression and violence, and on the other into a provider role which can lead to crime when no other options are available because of a perceived need to care for family, whatever the risk. Both of these positions, however, take one thing as given: men commit more crime, and the task at hand is finding out why. The question being asked, thus, is why do men commit more crime than women? For the moment, we're going to completely discard that assumption and make a different one: men and women commit the same amount of crime. With that in mind, we'll ask a very different question: if men and women commit equal amounts of crime, why are so many men in jail? This sounds irreconcilable, right? I mean, there's no way the disparity could be that great without men committing more crime. It's huge. Well, let's start at the beginning, by asking questions. We've assumed that men and women as classes commit equal amounts of crime, but are they punished equally? We've all heard about discrimination against people of color in the courts, so could the same thing be happening to men? That's just not possible, is it, in our patriarchal male-centered men-first culture, right? Wrong. A black person is approximately 19% more likely to be convicted than a white person, but a man is approximately 165% more likely to be convicted than a woman. The bias is greater by a factor of 8. If you understand how statistics work, this means that if a white woman has a 100% adjusted chance, we're doing comparisons, remember, and not tests, so this is valid, then a black woman has a 119% chance, a white man has a 265% chance, and a black man has, at least, a 315% chance. Thus, if we have the same number of criminals of each type at trial, if 10 white women are convicted, the numbers will end up like so: 10 white women, 12 black women, 27 white men, 32 black men. With exactly the same number of equally guilty people of each race, gender, we saw 22 women convicted, and 59 men. Big difference, eh? In fact, this factor alone gives us a prison population that's 73% male and 27% female. That's 3 men in jail for every woman, but still far from our 93 to 7%, which is 13 men for every woman. We've made an assumption, though, men and women are given the same sentence. Turns out, that's simply not true. Overall, women get 40% shorter sentences, which if use women as a baseline means that if women get 100% sentences, men get 166%. There is of course also a race component, but we won't worry about it here. Suffice it to say that the race component is smaller than the gender component. What that means is that if a woman gets a 1-year sentence, a man will get a 1.66-year sentence. What effect does this have on our prison population? Simple, it raises the number of men in prison at any one time by a factor of about 1.7. If we go back to our earlier set of people, this means that if we're counting in years and the average 100% sentence is 1 year, we'll have the same 22 women in jail, but 98, not 59 men. How about we run the percentages again? This time we've got 82% men, or 4 to 1. At the very least this means we've got either a third as many women in jail as we should, or 3 times too many men. 2 simple factors, and from the exact same number of criminals with the exact same level of guilt we're already up to 4 men in prison for every woman. Since the actual numbers are 93% to 7%, how close are we? Not very, actually, but we're already very far from even. As every good infomercial will say, but wait, there's more. See, up until now we've been presuming that everybody serves the entirety of their sentence, but in real life that's not actually true, is it? Most offenders get out early, on parole. So how do the numbers stack up? Actually, we don't know. There isn't very much information available on the point of parole, but in practice we'd expect to see more of the same: women more likely to be paroled, and parole at an earlier date. This means that 166% sentence could easily get higher by comparison, and quickly. Since parole eligibility comes after serving only 33% of a sentence, more women being paroled could easily substantially reduce their average sentence. This isn't even the last of it. We made one final assumption, way back at the beginning, that the number of people brought to trial was equal. The thing is, that's not actually true either. Regardless of who committed the crime, it's more likely that a man will be arrested, and the police are more willing to take a man to court in the first place. This means that if we go all the way back to the beginning, to the actual point where women and men commit an equal number of crimes, we see several effects. First, some men are arrested and brought to trial for the crimes of women, crimes not committed by men in the first place. Second, of the cases where they correctly identify a female perpetrator, we'll see a higher percentage of those where the perpetrator simply isn't brought to trial at all. Also note that men being brought to trial on flimsier evidence isn't going to reduce the conviction rate any, that's already stuck. This also considers the fact that men are more likely to be victims of false accusations of IPV, sexual assault or rape, especially in places with no drop prosecution for those offenses. We don't have adequate data on either of these, but we can make a couple wild-ass guesses and see where we end up. Note, this is where the relatively reliable data ends. From here on it's a thought experiment rather than analysis. Let's suppose that the sentences women serve are 20% shorter, that 10% of men are blamed for crimes committed by women, surprisingly reasonable, it turns out, and women are 20% less likely to be brought to trial. Starting with 100% of crimes for each, we first shift 10% from women to men, women, 90%, men, 110%. Now we subtract 20% of the female number from it, women, 72%, men, 110%. We now go to trial, for which we'll equalize back to 100% of women as perpetrators and adjust the number of men accordingly, women, 100%, men, 153%. Note that just from this, by the time we walk into the courtroom we've already got 50% more men than women. We haven't even had a trial yet. We now have a trial, with the conviction rates we outlined: 265%. Women, 100%, men, 405%. We're already at 4-to-1, note how things compound. Next, we apply the sentencing differential of 166%. Women, 100%, men, 675%. Finally, we apply our parole differential: 80% for women means 125% for men. Women, 100%, men, 844%. So what our ratio? 89% men to 11% women. If we raise the additional chance of a man being brought to trial from 20% to 40%, our ratio becomes 92% to 8%. This might strike you as unreasonable, but remember that the numbers confirm men being convicted 2.5 times as often and getting over 50% longer sentences. We regularly see cases that would have led to an attempted murder charge for a man being basically dismissed because it was a woman holding the knife, and if you take a look around you'll see the same. I'll let you go through those figures yourself if you wish. I think permutation of ninja starts to make some assumptions towards the end, but for the most part is on the right track. So now we have 3 possibilities as to why there are more males in prison than females. Societal influence, biological influence, or legal bias. My personal point of view is that all 3 probably play a part, and that legal bias is the main one we should be focusing on. It should be impartial, and gender shouldn't be a factor. Even if we accept that society, or biology, or both, are major factors, it still shouldn't change the fact that the court system should be equal and fair to everyone, male or female. If a male with a history of being abused commits an horrendous murder, he should not get a harsher sentence than a female with the same background, who has committed the same crime. But is this actually the case? Is what permutation of ninjas proposed fact, or do women get longer sentences due to patriarchal oppression or whatever, as Gothmoth seems to think? Well, at least in the case of spousal homicide. To find out the answer, Let's have a look at a study done in the last couple of years. Professor Starr's research shows large unexplained gender disparities in federal criminal cases. November 16, 2012. If you're a criminal defendant, it may help, a lot, to be a woman. At least, that's what Professor Sonia Starr's research on federal criminal cases suggests. Professor Starr's recent paper, Estimating Gender Disparities in Federal Criminal Cases, looks closely at a large data set of federal cases, and reveals some significant findings. After controlling for the arrest offense, criminal history, and other prior characteristics, men receive 63% longer sentences on average than women do, and women are twice as likely to avoid incarceration if convicted. This gender gap is about 6 times as large as the racial disparity that Professor Starr found in another recent paper. There are other studies that have shown gender disparity in criminal cases, but not as pronounced as Professor Starr's findings. This is because she is looking at a larger swath of the criminal justice process. In her analysis, she said. The paper states, existing studies have typically focused on single stages of the criminal process in isolation, in particular, the judge's final sentencing decision. These studies compare actual sentencing outcomes after controlling for the recommended sentence associated with the defendant's ultimate conviction. The problem with this, Starr explains, is that the key control variable is itself the result of a host of discretionary decisions made earlier in the justice process, including prosecutors' charging and plea bargaining decisions. Starr's research incorporates disparities found at those earlier stages, and finds that more disparity is introduced at each phase of the justice process. But the finding of her study is nothing new. From Los Angeles Daily Journal, 2001. Males get longer sentences than females for same crime. When Ed Urdiales was murdered in Colorado, 2 completely different juries convicted 2 different people of the crime. Both juries believed there was only one murderer. One convicted Bobby Hogan, a woman. The other convicted Jess Jacobs, a man. She got 10 years in prison. He was put to death. This case is just one example of the discrimination men face in criminal courts throughout the United States. According to Pradeep Ramanathan, Vice President of the National Coalition of Free Men and CFM, a volunteer, non-profit organization that has explored and addressed men's issues since 1976, all the research clearly demonstrates that gender is the most significant biasing factor in determining whether or not someone will be charged, prosecuted, indicted and sentenced, as well as determining the severity of the sentence. And Ramanathan is right. Department of Justice figures show that being male increases a murderer's chance of receiving a death sentence by more than 20 times. And the data repeatedly confirms that men receive higher sentences than women for the exact same crime. One study, published in Justice Quarterly in 1986, examined 181,197 felonies in California and found that, for the same crime, being male increased the chance of incarceration by 165%. Being black, in comparison, increased the chance of incarceration by 19%. Another study, published in Crime and Delinquency in 1989, examined non-accomplice crimes and factored together the number of charges, convicted offenses, prior felony convictions, as well as the race, age, work history and family situation of the accused and found that gender differences, favoring women, are more often found than race differences, favoring whites. In yet another study, published in the International Journal of the Sociology of Law, researchers Matthews and Greff and Randall Thompson found that being male increases sentence lengths more than any other discriminatory variable. The bias applies to victims as well as the accused. When Edward Glaser of Harvard University and Bruce Saserd out of Dartmouth College examined 2,800 homicide cases randomly drawn from 33 urban counties by the Bureau of Justice Statistics, they found that killing a female instead of a male increased sentences by 40.6%. Killing a white instead of a black, in comparison, increased sentences by 26.8%. Even when the exact same type of crime is accounted for, the disparities still persist. For example, a drunk driver who kills a black male receives an average sentence of 2 years. A drunk driver who kills a white male, 4 years. A drunk driver who kills a white female, 6 years. To those who recognize the problem, gender stereotypes are a major culprit. In a 1991 NCFM report titled Gender and Injustice, researchers John Ryan and Ian Wilson suggest the problem stems from stereotypes about women being more innocent, more reformable and less dangerous than men. Barbara Swartz, former director of New York's Women's Prison Project, called it the chivalry factor and says, if there were more women judges, more women would go to jail. Others attribute the problem to the devaluing of male lives. But addressing the causes does little good when the public does not even recognize the problem. One reason that we don't is that the task forces that we appoint to investigate the problem are just as biased as the legal system that they are supposed to monitor, so a full picture of the bias never gets drawn. In 1980, the National Organization for Women and the National Association of Women Judges formed the National Judicial Education Program to promote equality for women and men in the courts and JEP. In 1986, they wrote, Operating a Task Force on Gender Bias in the Courts, a Manual for Action, which became the manual used by gender bias task forces nationwide. The manual opens by stating that gender bias operates more frequently against women and that it is not a contradiction for task forces to focus primarily on bias against women in courts. As one might guess, this is exactly what the task forces do. None of the commissions study bias against men, said Ramanathan. For example, even though men are more likely to get prison and women to get probation for the same crime, a New York task force claimed that it is women who were discriminated against because, get this, they receive longer probation periods. One commission recently justified giving women shorter sentences because women are often custodial parents. But the sentencing disparities persisted in the above studies that took family situations are accounted for. So even if custodial parenthood justifies a shorter sentence, courts are giving men longer sentences than women even when neither, or both, are custodial parents. Needless to say, when a father commits a crime, the courts have no trouble calling him an unfit parent and removing him from his kids. The gender bias in our courts and in our gender bias task forces is not just an injustice to the victims. It is a tragic betrayal of public trust. In fact, as embarrassing as it sounds, we may need to create task forces to investigate the gender bias of the task forces that we created to investigate gender bias in the first place. So in general, it's safe to say, there is a bias in the court system when it comes to males committing crimes. But to be fair, Gothmoth's original claim, as well as the claim made by the feminist Facebook post, was specific to cases of spousal homicide. So is it possible that, despite the courts being biased towards men in general, the courts could be biased towards women when it comes to spousal homicide? Well, let's look at some stats and find out. Unfortunately, I was unable to find any recent statistics on sentencing that specifically deal with spousal homicide. Once again, if Gothmoth wants to provide recent studies, I'd be more than happy to look at them, although given my interaction with her to date, I won't be holding my breath. But I do have some interesting statistics from the Bureau of Justice Statistics fact sheet from 1995. I'd prefer to use something more recent, as circumstances may have changed in the last 20 years, but at least this is from the same time period as the claims made in the Facebook post. It states, in a sample of homicide cases in 75 of the nation's most populous counties, state court judges or juries during 1988 acquitted 6% of the husband defendants, compared to 31% of the wife defendants. Jury trials ended in acquittal for 27% of wives, but none of the husbands. Moreover, convicted husbands were more likely to receive a term of imprisonment 94% of the husbands versus 81% of the wives, and the average prison sentence for husbands was much longer, 16 years for husbands versus 6 years for wives. It's interesting that the last line is almost the exact opposite of what was claimed in the feminist Facebook post. It's almost as if someone just reversed the numbers and passed it off as fact. But this isn't the only discrepancy in that post. The quote at the end, from the Boston Globe, has been slightly changed. The words murdering men has been replaced by the words killing men. Maybe they thought the term murdering, was a little too harsh, and took it upon themselves to change it. But I can't blame the Facebook posters for this one, as this can be traced back to Michigan Women's Justice and Clemency Project, as well as appearing in its altered form in the Now article. But let's go back to those statistics for a moment. In 44% of wife-defendant cases, there was evidence the husband had assaulted the wife at the time of the killing. In 10% of husband-defendant cases, evidence was present that the wife had assaulted the husband prior to the killing. Assaulted wives were convicted by either guilty plea or trial verdict 56% of the time. The comparable conviction rate for unprovoked wives was 86%. For unprovoked husbands, 88%. I find the wording of this extremely interesting. I'm not sure how many of you picked it up, so let me explain. In 44% of wife-defendant cases, there was evidence the husband had assaulted the wife at the time of the killing. Note the term, at the time of the killing. I'm guessing many people, and probably all feminists, would assume this is therefore a straightforward case of self-defense. But let me ask you a question: if someone tried to kill you, be it a spouse, or a stranger, or anyone, would you try to fight back? I would. In fact, I can't think of anyone I know who wouldn't. So although it's true that an assault at the time of the killing may be the reason for the killing, in other words, the woman was defending herself against her male attacker, it could also indicate that the husband assaulted the wife at the time of the killing, in an attempt to defend himself. Both of these scenarios are possible, but what percentage of each makes up the 44% isn't possible to say. It's also possible in many cases that both partners were violent. But let's compare that to the next line. In 10% of husband-defendant cases, evidence was present that the wife had assaulted the husband prior to the killing. Now this is interesting, as the previous line referred to the time of the killing, yet here we see, prior to the killing. I wonder why the difference? I don't doubt that some women killed their husbands in self-defense, but I also don't doubt that in some cases, self-defense is used as an excuse for murder. And we also see at the end of the paragraph, unprovoked cases almost have an equal conviction rate. So Gothmoth's claim, as well as the Facebook post, have nothing to support them, yet there are feminist groups insisting that women get a raw deal in the justice system, and deserve special treatment, including no jail time, because they are female. What was it that James Kell said about chocolate sprinkles? Speaking of James, I've run out of time, so we'll finish off his article next time. But until then folks, always remember, don't drink the poison Kool-Aid.
Have tiny cups, and Marais have tiny cups, and Marais have tiny cups, and Marais have tiny cups. They will never eat up Box virgins for life.